Hello everybody, welcome to Resident Evil 4 Station's brand new series called Was There a Resident Evil 4 Before Resident Evil 4? So the point of this series, if you couldn't tell by the name of it, is about games like Resident Evil 4 before Resident Evil 4 released. And in this series I will go over 4 of the biggest games I found over the years that resemble Resident Evil 4 more than any other third-person shooters out there. Now before we get into the first game, I want to go over what defines Resident Evil 4's mark on third-person shooters, and what impact has been left by Resident Evil 4. Now if you ever go down the rabbit hole of most influential games of all time, you will always get into arguments about what influenced what, and if some of the most influential games of all time are really that influential. Now with Resident Evil 4, I think it is very important to make it clear that what it did for third-person shooters was make game developers realize how to make an over-the-shoulder camera work, and it did it by making it dynamic. Now while this is such a very small detail that a lot of people seem to take for granted nowadays, to the point that some even forget what is over the shoulder and isn't, it is very important to see just how different most third-person shooters were before Resident Evil 4. A lot of people think something like Siphon Filter is over the shoulder, which it clearly is not.
Leon,
I have some bad news.
This is what Grand Theft Auto San Andreas looked like in 2004. This is what Grand Theft Auto 4 looked like in 2008. This is how Tomb Raider games looked and played in the mid to late 2000s. This is what Tomb Raider looked like in 2013. This is what Siphon Filter looked like in 1999. This is what Siphon Filter Logan's Shadow looked like in 2007.
hook onto the debris.
This is what Metal Gear Solid 3 looked like in 2004. This is what Metal Gear Solid 4 looked like in 2008. A lot of people think Win-Back Covert Operations is over the shoulder, which it is not on either Nintendo 64 or PlayStation 2, which you are seeing on screen here. Win-Back does however deserve credit for being, as far as I know, the first third-person shooter using a laser sight. Let me know if there are other third-person shooters before Win-Back that used a laser sight.
Win-Back 2, Project Poseidon.
I see a lot of people mention the Tomb Raider games before Resident Evil 4 as over the shoulder, which, as you already saw earlier, was not until the 2013 game. Now whether or not you feel Resident Evil 4 is one of the most influential games of all time or not is up to you, but you can't deny Resident Evil 4 deserves a lot of credit for how it changed third-person shooters. Not that long ago in 2018, people on Reset Era did not think Resident Evil 4 was that influential at all, and even thought PUBG was more influential than Resident Evil 4. However, in 2024 here we are, and that same site now looks as Resident Evil 4 as being up there with Ocarina of Time as one of the most influential games of all time. For some of the younger people out there that weren't around in the late 2000s, oof, that makes me feel old. Resident Evil 4 got snubbed a lot on most influential games list during that time. Some of it was Wii Sports and Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare being the hot thing at the time, and both would change motion controls and first-person shooters in gaming a lot. But another big reason Resident Evil 4 was snubbed a lot during this time was because Gears of War came out close to 2 years later and would also influence a lot of third-person shooters around this time. Even Resident Evil 5 would have some Gears of War-inspired controls to it. Now, for whatever reason, Resident Evil 4 seems to be given the limelight again on its mark on third-person shooters. It may be since then we had a lot of developers cite Resident Evil 4 for inspiration, such as Dead Space, space, which according to co-designer Ben Wana was supposed to be System Shock 3 but was changed to a new IP after Resident Evil 4 released to have similar gameplay as Resident Evil 4. Even Gears of War creator Cliff Bleszinski cited Resident Evil for a big inspiration to Gears of War because of its dynamic over-the-shoulder camera and also liked its pacing. He also cited Kill Switch for its cover system and Bionic Commando. Also, if Jun Takeuchi is to be believed in this 2022 interview with Shinji Mikami at E3 2006 when the Gears of War team looked at the Lost Planet demo and asked why they weren't using the Resident Evil 4 camera. That shows that the Gears of War team considered the dynamic over-the-shoulder camera to be Resident Evil 4's revolution.
なんか向こうのチームに取り囲まれて、バイオ4のあのカメラはそう発明だったのになんであのカメラにしないんだって散々言われて、いやいやゲーム違うじゃんって話で。
そうね。
でも俺らちょっとあのカメラを参考にしてギアを作ったんだよ。見てよみたいなんで引きずり回された思い出はありますけどね。
Other games you wouldn't have thought of being influenced by Resident Evil 4 also include BioShock and God of War 2018. I think with all the game devs that have named Resident Evil 4 as inspiration has helped give it the legendary status it has now that it wasn't originally given soon after release, but who knows?
You know, the other person that we met that we're big fans of,
Shinji Mikami from Resident Evil.
He came by, and we were just like two kids in a candy store on that one too. We did.
We're like, what made you like bring the camera in and like shift the character to the side to get that composition? Because that like changed the industry and
he ended up talking about particles, and we're just like, yeah, particles. Tell me more about particles. Like, so how did you like?
And we told him, like, you know, the chainsaw guy from Resident Evil 4, that's basically our clicker.
Yes.
It's the chainsaw guy from Resident Evil 4. Like, we tell him everything we ripped him off of his game.
Yeah. I'm sure he hates us. Mikami-san was like, same thing, same exact thing. He was just making what he thought was a cool evolution for Resident Evil that, again, nobody was setting out to revolutionize anything. That's it. Just make what's true to your heart.
Gears of War turns 20 in 2 years, and if Gearsy Day comes out around that time and is a huge financial and critical success, I could totally see the public opinion maybe favor Gears again. It helps Resident Evil 4's legacy that right now Resident Evil 4 is the 4th best-selling game in the franchise, and the remake is currently the fastest-selling Resident Evil launch aligned with other Resident Evil titles. Also, a game like Resident Evil 8 Village, which is heavily inspired by Resident Evil 4, just hit 10 million in sales, and was the fastest to hit the 10 million number. That is until Resident Evil 4 Remake hits it faster most likely. Now that we got all that out of the way, let us get back to what this video is about, and that is looking at third-person shooters that did Resident Evil 4 before Resident Evil 4. The main event, and that is with the first game in this video series being 2001's Conker's Bad Fur Day.
I don't ever remember being a part of your crappy script. Why don't you do us all a favor and leave?
¿Qué carajo estás haciendo aquí?
¡Rápido! 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 ¡Larga! ¡Usa los músculos! ¡Rápido! ¡Apúrense!
Who are these people?
¡Rápido! ¡Apúrense! ¡Rápido! ¡Apúrense! ¡Rápido! ¡Rápido!
¡No dejes que se escape!
¡Ay! ¡Se vuelve loco! ¡Mierda! ¡Rápido! ¡Rápido! ¡Rápido!
¡Te voy a arrancar! ¡Lórgate, cabrón!
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
While you may be puzzled as to why a platformer game would have anything to do with possibly doing Resident Evil 4's shooter mechanics before Resident Evil 4 did, is because of one thing. Conker had the over-the-shoulder camera nearly a whole 4 years before Resident Evil 4 did, all the way back on the Nintendo 64. Now before we get any further, I need to point out that this is just used in a short section of the game and some context-sensitive parts. But look at this. You not only have the over-the-shoulder camera when aiming, but you can also move as well, which is a complaint I've seen thrown at Resident Evil 4, even close to launch despite it being the proper method of using firearms. Not only are those two things here, but if you haven't noticed already, it also uses the laser sight Resident Evil 4 uses as well, and even has a giant moon in the background like some parts of Resident Evil 4 as well. Man, are we sure that it wasn't Conker that heavily influenced Resident Evil 4 and so many third-person shooters afterwards? Well, to be quite honest, I think we can say it did not have much influence, if any at all, on third-person shooters. For one, despite being a beloved game scoring a 92 on Metacritic, I don't think anyone looks at Conker with praise because of its short sections that have the over-the-shoulder camera. It's loved for its extremely raunchy humor. Also nowadays a lot of these sections are a pain to play, and I remember how hard some parts were when I first played this game in 2016. By the way, I think now is a good time to let you guys know that all footage you are seeing is from the rare replay version of the game. But yes, I did finish the game on the Nintendo 64 back on September 29, 2016, and again on April 12, 2024 on Xbox One. I also think when I see a lot of people say Conker was more influential, or even in some cases did the over-the-shoulder better than Resident Evil 4, forget some important things. First, the short part of Conker that has the over-the-shoulder camera and laser sight aiming doesn't have a dynamic camera. When you exit out of it, the camera goes back to normal. Also, while this is completely subjective, the controls in Conker's Bad Fur Day make it a pain to actually use. Yes, I know the same could be said about Resident Evil 4 nowadays, but the limitations of the Nintendo 64 controller doesn't help at all. Had they been able to use a dual analog setup, Conker might have been able to come up with a control scheme when using the over-the-shoulder camera that didn't require the C buttons that have controls over both strafing side to side and also controlling Conker's movement for back and forward movement. At least not only did Gears use Resident Evil 4's dynamic camera, but also follows Resident Evil 4's camera method where the character is always facing forward besides when taking cover. Maybe Conker did influence Resident Evil 4 with its laser sight, but the same could be said about Winback, and without confirmation from the developers we will never know for sure. I will say Shinji Mikami was quite a big Nintendo fan, so I could see him seeing Conker and seeing some inspiration, but you could say the same about the next game in this series I will look over in another video. Also, another thing that hurts Conker's influence with the over-the-shoulder camera is later in this same game. They drop the over-the-shoulder camera in this part of the game.
Okay, soldier. Move it out.
About half a year after Resident Evil 4 released, the remake of Conker's Bad Fur Day was released on Xbox called Conker Live and Reloaded. This remake of the game pretty much uses the over-the-shoulder camera whenever you need to aim a weapon instead of just the zombie part of the game. Now, if the limitation of the Nintendo 64 controller and the fact that the over-the-shoulder camera wasn't used in the military section part wasn't enough to hurt Conker's case for being influential to third-person shooters, then this next thing will. The fact on the Nintendo 64 that the multiplayer mode doesn't use it at all. Earlier I showed you footage of Neil Druckmann asking Mikami how he got that composition of the character being placed to the corner. Well, did you know in 2001 Neil Druckmann got first place at a Conker multiplayer tournament? Think about that. Had Conker used the over-the-shoulder camera in its multiplayer mode, which is one of the more praised aspects of the game nowadays, Neil and so many other developers might have been inspired by Conker. This shows the fact that Conker not committing to the over-the-shoulder perspective hurts the case of it being influential to third-person shooters. Also, since Conker didn't fully commit to the over-the-shoulder camera for all the times she used the gun, that begs the question, did the devs know how to implement the over-the-shoulder in all situations? That is what Resident Evil 4 gets credit for when it comes to its influence in gaming. Its dynamic over-the-shoulder camera isn't just used in third-person shooters, it is used in many genres of gaming. But if that isn't enough for the small group of people who loudly claim Conker deserves more credit for the over-the-shoulder camera, well, there are two games in 1998 that used it too, so technically not only did Conker not inspire many devs, if any at all, to use the over-the-shoulder camera like Resident Evil 4, it wasn't even the first. Now, the two games I am talking about I will not show because I might want to save them for another video. Now, while I am being really hard on Conker, I want to make it clear, had Conker released to a bigger audience, it might have influenced developers in many other ways, like how to make funny parodies of pop culture. To give Conker more credit though, it did use the over-the-shoulder aiming at certain context-sensitive parts in the game. However, whether or not it is intentional or unintentional, in 2004 when Resident Evil 4 was being previewed, a lot of previews used the term context-sensitive. It is the exact term Conker uses at the very beginning of the game. Conker might have had some inspiration on that front, but it's not like if Conker didn't exist, it's not like 100 other games before Resident Evil 4 figured out how to make a single button have multiple uses. It's just funny the same term was used. In fact, Conker's context-sensitive button scheme is more limiting than how Ocarina of Time handles it, which Star Fox Adventures expanded on. Also, Star Fox Adventures doesn't have an over-the-shoulder perspective when aiming, so it shows other teams that Rare weren't sure about it after Conker's method, even though they had the C stick on the GameCube controller. But to be fair, after Resident Evil 4, the Lost Planet team at Capcom didn't use the over-the-shoulder camera either. I do think Rare might have possibly inspired the Resident Evil 4 merchant with Star Fox Adventures though. Only a year after the Shinji Mikami GameCube announcement happened, Star Fox Adventures would release and have a merchant character as well. I find it funny tricky as you're Ashley in that game.
Scarab, you wish to gamble?
Oh, no.
Guess I'm not going back that way.
Now, this isn't to say Conker isn't a notable game whatsoever. I won't lie, I absolutely hate the Saving Private Ryan chapter of the game. Back in 2016, I died like 200 times when trying to get past this part in June of 2016 and straight up gave up. Later in September of 2016, I got it on my second try. In April of this year, I died in this part like 40 times before I finally got past it. This game can be really frustrating to go back to, but at the same time, I don't think it is a bad game, but it does not play well 23 years later. The remake is much more replayable, but it did feel a bit more slippery in some parts. However, the hovercraft part was like 100 times harder in the remake. I just think anyone who thinks Resident Evil 4's influence is dismissed because of Conker is missing the big point. Yes, it could totally be possible that Shinji Mikami was inspired by Conker or some other game with the over-the-shoulder camera, but Resident Evil 4 was the one that popularized it. Mostly by making it dynamic, but also by pulling it off so well and making such a mind-blowing game that so many other developers afterwards took notes from. Conker definitely deserves credit for being one of the first games to use it, but I have yet to see a popular third-person shooter say they were inspired by Conker. It is totally possible the next video game I will talk about in this series could have been inspired by Conker, but as of right now we don't know of any developer that claims Conker inspired them. Now, if you made it this far into the video, I want to thank you so much, and just want to give you a preview of the next game in this video series.
Stay calm. You're gonna answer some questions.
And who might you be?
Also, I would like to thank naturalreaders.com for helping me make this video. Also on June 30th I am rebranding my second channel to Resident Evil 4 City. Check it out if you are interested. Link in the description and pinned comment below. Also if you like this video please check out my Resident Evil 4 glitch video 8 if you want to see how much you can break Resident Evil 4.